This happened 6 months ago and I'm still processing it. Throwaway, because this is too personal for my main account, but I need to get this out somewhere because the anger is eating me alive. I, 28F, have been working at a small marketing company for about 3 years. It's one of those we're like family here, places with about 15 employees, owned by this guy Marcus, 52M, who likes to think he's some kind of progressive boss because he has a ping-pong table and lets people wear jeans. The office was in one of those converted warehouse spaces downtown, all exposed brick and open floor plans, with motivational posters about disrupting the industry and thinking outside the box. Marcus always talked a big game about work-life balance and supporting his employees, but the reality was different. He expected everyone to be available 24/7, responded to emails at midnight and expected immediate responses, and had this weird thing about loyalty where he'd guilt-trip people for taking vacation days or sick leave. When I found out I was pregnant last year, I was over the moon. My husband Jake and I had been trying for 2 years, including a miscarriage at 8 weeks that devastated us both. We'd done fertility testing, changed our diets, tracked ovulation obsessively, the whole 9 yards. So when we made it past the first trimester, we thought we were in the clear. I remember the day I told Jake about the positive test. He literally fell to his knees in our kitchen and started crying happy tears. We'd been through so much disappointment that we almost couldn't believe it was real. We waited until 12 weeks to tell anyone, and even then, we were cautious about getting too excited. But as the weeks passed and everything looked healthy, we started to relax. We picked out names, bought a crib, painted the nursery. Jake would talk to my belly every night, telling the baby about his day at work, he's a teacher, and promising to teach them how to throw a baseball and ride a bike. I told Marcus about the pregnancy when I was about 16 weeks along. I'd been putting it off because I'd heard him make comments about other women in the office over the years. Nothing overly illegal, but little remarks about how women always leave right when you need them most, and how he preferred hiring people without complicated personal lives. When I finally told him, sitting in his glass-walled office with its ridiculous standing desk and collection of entrepreneurship books, he seemed supportive at first. He asked about my due date, made jokes about how I'd probably want to bring the baby to work sometimes like some of the other companies in our building. I gave him my projected maternity leave dates, February 15th due date, planning to take 12 weeks of FMLA leave, and he nodded along like it was all perfectly reasonable. But I should have known better. As my pregnancy progressed, Marcus started making comments. Little things at first. Make sure you finish the Johnson project before you disappear for 3 months. I hope you're training someone to cover your clients, because we can't just put everything on hold while you're playing house. I tried to brush it off as awkward humor, but the comments got worse as I got bigger. He'd make remarks about how pregnant women are unreliable and how he was learning his lesson about hiring women of childbearing age. During team meetings, he looked directly at me while talking about employees who aren't fully committed to their roles. He started excluding me from important meetings, saying I probably wouldn't be around long enough for it to matter anyway. When I'd ask about being included, he'd claim he was just trying to spare me the stress since I had other priorities now. The worst was when he started making comments about my performance. I'd been one of the top performers in the company for 3 years running, consistently exceeding my targets and bringing in new clients. But suddenly, Marcus was nitpicking everything I did. My client presentations weren't energetic enough. My email responses weren't prompt enough. My project timelines were unrealistic. I documented everything, thinking I might need it later. I had no idea how much I'd actually need those notes. I started keeping a detailed log of every discriminatory comment, every excluded meeting, every unfair performance review. I saved emails and made notes immediately after conversations. My coworker Sarah, who'd become a close friend, started witnessing some of the interactions and offering to back me up if needed. "This is pregnancy discrimination," she told me one day over lunch. "You know that, right? What he's doing is illegal." I knew she was right, but I also knew I needed the job and the health insurance. Jake's teacher salary was decent, but we couldn't afford to lose my income, especially with a baby coming. So I kept my head down and tried to make it work. The stress was affecting my pregnancy. My doctor noticed my blood pressure was elevated at several appointments and asked if I was dealing with unusual stress at work. I tried to minimize it, but she could tell something was wrong. "Stress isn't good for you or the baby," Dr. Rodriguez told me during my 32-week appointment. "If your work environment is toxic, you need to consider making changes." But what changes could I make? I needed the health insurance for the delivery. I needed the income for maternity leave. I felt trapped. My due date was February 15th. I worked right up until February 10th, staying late every night to finish all my projects and create detailed handover documents for my maternity leave coverage. I made lists of every client contact, every ongoing project, every password and login the temp would need. Everything was organized and ready. Marcus made a big show of how inconvenient my timing was, even though I'd given him 4 months' notice of my due date. "I guess the baby doesn't care about our Q1 deadlines," he said during my last team meeting, making everyone uncomfortable. February 12th, I went into labor at 3 a.m. Jake and I were so excited. After all the waiting and worrying, our baby was finally coming. We grabbed our hospital bag, which I'd packed and repacked obsessively for weeks, and headed to the maternity ward. Labor was long and difficult. After 18 hours of contractions, pushing, and increasing medical intervention, our son was born at 9:17 p.m. And he wasn't breathing. The cord had wrapped around his neck during delivery, what the doctors called a tight nuchal cord. The medical team tried everything: resuscitation, emergency procedures, medications. I remember the room filling with people, everyone working frantically while Jake and I held hands and prayed. But our baby, Noah, was gone. I have no words for what it feels like to hold your child, knowing they'll never open their eyes, never cry, never do any of the things you spent 9 months dreaming about. Jake and I were destroyed, just completely shattered. The silence in that delivery room was deafening. After hours of medical equipment beeping and doctors calling out instructions, suddenly everything was quiet except for my sobs and Jake's whispered, "I'm sorry," over and over again. The nurses were incredible. They cleaned Noah up and wrapped him in a soft blue blanket, then placed him in my arms. He was perfect. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, with Jake's dark hair and what looked like my nose. He looked like he was sleeping peacefully. We spent 3 days in the hospital while I recovered physically, and we tried to process what had happened. The bereavement team helped us with memory making. They took professional photos of our family, made hand and footprint molds, and helped us create a memory box with Noah's hospital bracelet and the blanket he was wrapped in. They treated Noah with so much dignity and love, talking to him by name and handling him like the precious baby he was. It meant everything to us. On the 3rd day, while I was sitting in the hospital bed holding Noah and going through brochures from funeral homes, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Marcus. "Maya, heard about your situation from Jenny in HR. Since you're no longer a mother, you won't be needing maternity leave anymore. Don't bother coming back. We've already filled your position with someone who can actually commit to being here. Your final paycheck will be direct deposited minus the health insurance costs we covered while you were out. Clean out your desk by end of week, or we'll donate your stuff to Goodwill. Good luck with whatever comes next." I stared at that message for probably 5 full minutes, holding my dead son, trying to comprehend what I was reading. He had fired me, by text message, while I was planning my baby's funeral, because I was no longer a mother. The cruelty of that phrase hit me like a physical blow. I was holding my child, and this man was telling me I wasn't a mother because Noah had died. As if my love for him, my bond with him, the life I'd carried for 9 months somehow didn't count because he couldn't breathe on his own. Jake saw my face and asked what was wrong. When I showed him the message, he literally threw up. Just ran to the hospital bathroom and puked from the sheer shock and disgust of it. I screenshotted the message immediately, though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely work my phone. Then I noticed something that made the situation even worse. Marcus had sent it to a group chat by mistake. It wasn't just to me. It went to 3 other employees, including Jenny from HR, who had apparently told him about Noah's death, and Sarah and another coworker named Mike. So not only did he fire me while I was grieving my dead child, he did it in front of witnesses who could see exactly what kind of monster he was. My phone started buzzing immediately with messages from my coworkers who had seen the group text. Everyone was horrified. Jenny was the first to call, apologizing frantically through tears. "Maya, I am so sorry about Noah. And I'm sorry about Marcus. I only told him what happened because I thought he should know for HR purposes, and I never, ever expected this reaction. This is beyond cruel. Sarah called next, and I could hear she was crying too. Maya, I'm so sorry about your baby. And what Marcus did, it's unforgivable. We're all talking about what we can do. This can't stand. Mike, who barely knew me since he worked in a different department, sent a text. I don't know you well, but I'm horrified by what I just saw. That message was sick. I'm documenting everything in case you need witnesses. Even people who weren't on the group chat started reaching out as word spread. Apparently, Jenny had been so upset that she told several other coworkers what had happened, and the story was spreading through the office like wildfire. I couldn't even respond to most of the messages. I was holding my dead baby and trying to figure out how to plan a funeral while processing the fact that my boss had just kicked me while I was at the lowest point of my entire life. That night, Jake and I barely slept. We were dealing with the logistics of what happens when a baby dies, funeral arrangements, paperwork, deciding whether to have an autopsy. And now we had to figure out how to survive financially to the list. We're going to sue him, Jake said around 3 a.m. as we lay in the dark. What he did is illegal, and it's evil, and we're not going to let him get away with it. I was too exhausted to think about legal action yet. All I wanted was to hold my baby and pretend, for a few more hours, that this nightmare wasn't real. The next few days were a blur of funeral planning, legal consultations, and trying to grieve while dealing with the most callous, cruel act I've ever experienced. We buried Noah on February 18th, exactly 1 week after he was born. It was a small service, just family and close friends. The funeral director was incredibly kind, treating our tiny son with such respect and care. We chose a white casket about the size of a shoebox, and Jake and I each wrote letters to Noah that we buried with him. I kept thinking about how I should have been home with him, starting maternity leave, learning how to be a mom, figuring out breastfeeding and diaper changes, and all the normal things new parents worry about. Instead, I was putting my baby in the ground and trying to figure out how to rebuild my entire life. Several of my coworkers came to the funeral, including Jenny and Sarah. They were so supportive, bringing food and flowers and just being present. It meant the world to us, especially knowing that they were risking their own jobs by supporting me so openly. Marcus didn't come. He didn't even send a card. The legal fallout started immediately. Jenny from HR had quietly been documenting Marcus's behavior for months, apparently. She'd been collecting his discriminatory comments about pregnant employees and was already considering reporting him when the group text incident happened. She reached out to me the day after Noah's funeral with a manila folder full of evidence, emails, recorded conversations, legal in our state, witness statements from other employees who'd heard his remarks. Turns out, I wasn't the only pregnant employee Marcus had targeted. There was a clear, documented pattern. I've been keeping records because I knew something like this would happen eventually, Jenny told me over coffee, her hands shaking as she handed me the folder. Marcus has a problem with women, especially pregnant women. What he did to you was so evil that I can't stay silent anymore. The folder was thick with documentation going back almost 2 years. There were emails where Marcus complained about unreliable female employees and their biological complications. There were recorded conversations where he'd made jokes about women getting knocked up and abandoning their responsibilities. Most damning were the patterns with other employees. 2 other women had left the company during or shortly after pregnancy due to his harassment. One, Melissa, had been laid off 2 weeks after announcing her pregnancy, despite being a top performer. Another, Rachel, had been systematically excluded from meetings and had her client load reduced until she felt forced to quit. Jenny had statements from both women, as well as from coworkers who'd witnessed the discrimination. She'd been building a case for months, waiting for the right moment to act. I should have done something sooner, she said, crying into her coffee. But I was scared of losing my job, and I convinced myself that maybe I was overreacting. But what he did to you, there's no excuse for that level of cruelty. I hired an employment lawyer who specialized in pregnancy discrimination. When I showed her the text message in Jenny's evidence folder, her exact words were, "This is the most clear-cut case of pregnancy discrimination I've ever seen, combined with some of the most callous behavior I've encountered in 20 years of practice." The lawyer, Maria Santos, explained that firing someone for pregnancy-related medical leave, even if the pregnancy ends in loss, is a violation of the Family and Medical Leave Act and the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. The fact that he'd done it by text message while I was grieving created additional grounds for emotional distress damages. The "no longer a mother" comment is particularly damaging, she explained. It shows a fundamental misunderstanding of both the law and basic human decency. This isn't just discrimination, it's deliberately inflicting emotional harm on a grieving parent. We filed suit within 2 weeks, seeking damages for lost wages, emotional distress, and punitive damages. The filing immediately made local news because of how egregious the facts were. Marcus's response was predictable. He tried to cover his tracks and control the narrative. He claimed the text was taken out of context and that he'd been misunderstood. He said he'd only meant that I wouldn't need the full 12 weeks of maternity leave anymore since there was no baby to care for, not that I was permanently fired. His story fell apart immediately. He'd already hired my replacement and had her start the day after he sent the text. Sarah had taken photos of my empty desk and the new person sitting there, going through my files. He'd also told multiple clients that I was no longer with the company and had decided not to return after her personal situation. When Maria confronted him with the evidence of the replacement hire, he changed his story again. Now he claimed that I had abandoned my position by not returning immediately after the birth, so he'd had no choice but to replace me. Your client gave birth to a stillborn baby on a Tuesday and was fired by text on Friday, Maria told his lawyer during a conference call I was listening to. Are you seriously arguing that she should have been back at work within 72 hours of delivering a dead child? The case gained significant media attention when someone leaked the story to a local journalist. The headline was something like, "Local business owner fires grieving mother by text. You're no longer a mother." It went viral on social media within hours. I woke up one morning to find that the story had been shared thousands of times on Facebook and Twitter. My phone was buzzing constantly with friend requests from strangers, interview requests from journalists, and messages of support from people all over the country who'd heard about what happened. Suddenly, Marcus's company was getting review bombed on Google and Yelp. People were calling the office to express their disgust. Potential clients were canceling contracts. The business was hemorrhaging money and reputation by the hour. Marcus tried to do damage control by posting a statement on the company website claiming that the story was one-sided and that he'd been unfairly characterized. He said he was a strong supporter of working mothers and that the situation had been misunderstood by the media. Nobody was buying it. The text message screenshots had been published, with my permission, and there was no way to spin "you're no longer a mother" as supportive of working parents. Employees started quitting en masse. Sarah was the first to go, posting on LinkedIn about her resignation with a statement about not being able to work for someone who would treat a grieving employee so cruelly. Within a week, 6 more people had quit, including Jenny and most of the senior staff. Marcus tried to reach out to me through mutual contacts, claiming he wanted to make things right, and offering to give me my job back with a raise and a formal apology. Maria's response was essentially, "Go fuck yourself. We'll see you in court." The discovery process revealed even more disturbing behavior. Marcus had been telling clients and vendors that pregnant employees were unreliable and not committed to their careers. He'd been systematically pushing out women who got pregnant and replacing them with younger, unmarried women who he thought would be more dedicated. We found emails where he'd specifically instructed HR not to hire women in their 20s or 30s because they might get pregnant and cause problems. There were messages to other business owners where he complained about dealing with all these biological complications and joked about wanting to hire only men and women over 45. Most horrifying were the comments he'd made to remaining employees about my situation. Multiple witnesses came forward to say he described Noah's death as probably for the best, since I wouldn't have been able to handle work and motherhood anyway. He'd also said that I was being dramatic about the whole situation and that losing a baby wasn't that big a deal, since we could just try again. Several former employees came forward with their own stories during the discovery process. It painted a picture of a man who saw pregnant women as inherently defective employees and who felt entitled to discriminate against them with impunity. The case settled out of court after 8 months for an amount I can't disclose due to the settlement agreement. Let's just say it was substantial enough to cover Noah's medical bills and funeral costs, replace the income I'd lost, compensate me for emotional distress, and allow me to take time to properly grieve without worrying about money. More importantly, the settlement required Marcus to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all employees, establish clear pregnancy accommodation policies, and submit to regular third-party audits of his hiring and firing practices for the next 3 years. He was also required to make a public apology, though it was clearly written by his lawyers and completely lacking in genuine remorse. He never personally apologized to me or even acknowledged the pain he'd caused. Jenny left the company before the settlement was finalized and found a much better job with a company that actually values ethical HR practices. She's thriving there and has become a good friend. Sarah and 3 other former employees started their own competing marketing firm and have been incredibly successful, poaching several of Marcus's biggest clients. Marcus's business never recovered from the scandal and mass exodus of employees. Last I heard, he was down to about 4 employees and was struggling to keep the doors open. Several more former employees have filed their own discrimination suits, and he's facing additional investigations from the Department of Labor. But honestly, none of that brings Noah back. None of it makes up for the fact that in my darkest moment, when I was holding my dead child and trying to figure out how to say goodbye to him forever, someone I had trusted and worked for kicked me while I was down in the cruelest way imaginable. I'm in grief counseling and trauma therapy now, working with specialists who understand both pregnancy loss and workplace trauma. The therapist says I'm dealing with compound grief, grieving both my son and the additional trauma of being victimized while at my most vulnerable. Some days I'm angry. Some days I'm just sad. Some days I feel like I handled everything exactly right. And some days I wonder if I should have just quietly let it go and focused on healing instead of putting myself through the stress of a lawsuit. But then I think about the other women Marcus targeted, and the ones he might have targeted in the future if no one had held him accountable. And I think about how he felt comfortable sending that message because he assumed I'd be too destroyed to fight back. He was wrong about that. I miss Noah every single day. I think about who he would have become, what he would have looked like, how his laugh would have sounded. I wonder if he would have had Jake's sense of humor or my stubbornness. I'll always be his mother, no matter what some ignorant asshole thinks. Jake and I are in counseling together and individually. We're talking about trying again, but we're taking it slow. The grief counselor says there's no timeline for healing, and we're learning to be patient with ourselves and each other. I'm working for a new company now that has actual family-friendly policies and leadership that understands that employees are human beings with complex lives, not just resources to be discarded when they become inconvenient. They have paid bereavement leave for pregnancy loss, comprehensive mental health benefits, and a culture that actually supports work-life balance. Marcus, if you somehow see this, I hope your business fails completely. I hope every pregnant employee you ever mistreated finds peace and success. And I hope you learn that treating people with basic human decency isn't optional, even when they're at their most vulnerable. Especially then. TLDR, lost my newborn son due to birth complications. While I was in the hospital holding him and planning his funeral, my boss fired me by group text saying I was no longer a mother, so didn't need maternity leave. Sued him for pregnancy discrimination, won a substantial settlement, and his business is now failing. Still grieving and healing, but glad I held him accountable.